You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 77. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Sara, I remember a cartoon, a Grin and Bear It cartoon that expressed one of the great needs of leaders. It showed two people in a waiting room of a doctor's office. And one of the persons says to the other, "Okay, it's agreed. Let's trade symptoms and find out if the doctor really listens." There's always been and always will be a need for listening. There's so great a need that we're willing to pay a lot of money to therapists, counselors, and other professionals to listen to us. And as you and I have found out, and I think it's just obvious, to some, it's obvious that listening is important for leaders. And for others, it's obvious that listening is not part of their leadership skills. So I'm hoping in today's episode that we'll explore why listening is important to becoming a courageous and vital leader.
Let me remind you that this episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a training experience for Christian leaders to learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture at church, at home, and in the workplace. It's just one way that we help you as a leader to transform your relationships with Christ, your congregation, and your local community. You can find resources for this episode and a way to sign up to be informed when Dare to Lead goes live at transformingmission.org/077. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to LeaderCast on your favorite podcast player. If you want to join all the cool kids, become a LeaderCast insider. You'll find links to your favorite podcast player and how to sign up to be an insider, making you the first to know when a new episode drops, as well as getting all of the downloads for episodes without filling out another form. We're trying to save you some time, friends, so subscribe and get the goodness the easy way. transformingmission.org/077. So I'm listening, Tim.
Okay, you and I both know that becoming a leader who listens is not easy. It takes time and it takes practice. We've discovered that, when we don't listen, we fail God. And you don't have to go very far in the scriptures to be able to find that. I mean, God wants us to listen to God. The psalmist said, "Oh, that my people would listen to me." And you can go to the Old Testament prophets. They cried out in despair when people would not listen. Actually, I think I have some pastors in the district who could be Old Testament prophets. We heard something from Jeremiah like, "For 23 years the word of the Lord has come to me, and I've spoken persistently to you, but you have not listened."
Okay, folks, this is one of those moments that I wish that we did this on video versus just audio, because what you can't see is Tim and I are both cracking up at this moment. Not that scripture is funny, it's just sometimes the truth is funny.
It certainly is. But I'll give you a couple more examples. Like in the New Testament, Jesus declares, "You who have ears to hear, listen." And then on the Mount of Transfiguration, the voice of God was heard saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him."
So I think you've made the case from scripture that listening is important. And just as you were walking through each of those scriptures, part of why I was chuckling is it has to be written in scripture to remind us to listen. And so if God has to remind us through his word to pause and listen, it's probably something that each one of us need to stop and ask ourselves, am I listening? Am I listening to God? Am I listening to the congregation? Am I listening to the community around me? And we're going to talk about each one of those things over the course of the next couple of episodes. So what else do you want to remind us about listening, Tim?
Well, just look at how we're created. I think it's important to remember that God's given us 2 ears and 1 mouth. I mean, could it be that we have opportunities to listen more than we have to speak? Or that God's given us the capacity to listen and we misuse that capacity when we're too busy, too distracted, too preoccupied, too privileged to hear what other persons are saying. I think there's another thing I'd like to point out as we move forward, and that is when we don't listen, we shut ourselves off from one another.
There's a biggie.
Well, we've talked about this on podcasts over and over, but we give up the opportunity to learn from one another, to understand one another, even to love one another if we're not listening. We give up the opportunity to develop the relationships that help us become who God has created us to be. So that begs a question, doesn't it?
It sure does. So why don't we listen? We want to walk through at least 5 reasons why we don't listen. And as we walk through each one of these, I want you to stop and ask yourself, how am I doing with that? Is that an area that I need to say to someone that I trust, hey, can you help me with this? And just say, hello, are you listening? Or to remind me and point out when I've done that well. And simply say to me, thanks for listening, so that you can be reinforced in the places where you're doing it well and in the places that you need to improve. We all can improve in this. So this isn't us trying to point fingers. We tend to do podcast episodes about things that are important to us and things that we want to continue growing and learning. So we're in this with you. So as we walk through each one of these, ask yourself, how am I doing with this? Is this an area that I might need to improve? Or what else does that make me think about in terms of listening? And who am I listening to well and who am I not? So what's the first reason we don't listen, Tim?
Well, I would say that we don't listen because we're too busy. Now, I'm not talking about time. It just seems that we're preoccupied with our own thoughts, needs, worries, and problems, too busy talking about ourselves to listen to others. You might give us an example of how that works.
Too busy with our face in our technology, looking at our cell phones or tablets, to pay attention to the people that are sitting right across this, I almost said right across the street, right across the table from us or in the next seat. If we're driving in a car, it is our technology. Well, it has helped us in so many ways. It can also be a distraction. So here's a personal example for me. I have, for about a year, been wearing an Apple Watch. And I really got it because I was noticing so much of the work that I do is at a computer, on the phone. And so I'm sitting a lot. And I know that I need to get up and move more. And so there's a part of an Apple Watch, if you're familiar with it, that if you haven't gotten up and moved in 50 minutes, it beeps at you. And so it's a reminder because we can get, especially I can get in the zone when I'm working and hours can go by and I will not get up and move. That's just who I am. When I'm in the zone, that's just what happens. But it got to the point that every time email would come on my phone, because your phone is connected to your watch, every time a message would come on Facebook, every time something would come on the news channels that I have on my phone, and yes, I absolutely could change those settings, I was getting these beeps on my watch. And so everything that was happening in the world around me was saying, hey, I'm urgent, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. And what I was noticing is I couldn't pay attention, one, to the work that I was trying to do, but more importantly, to the people around me, because something's constantly buzzing on my wrist. So I only wear it when I'm doing presentations and I need to keep track of time, or when I'm traveling someplace and I need to be somewhere by a certain time or not miss a plane or something like that, because it became one more distraction that pulled me away from what was happening around me instead of helping me to stay present to what was around me. So just an example.
And I remember a professor telling us a story once of how he had an exam to give to a class one day. And of course, in those days, I don't know what it's like now, but if you sat 10 minutes and the professor didn't show up, you could leave. And so there was an exam, everybody was there. 10 minutes went by, the professor hadn't shown up, everybody started leaving. And about the time they were leaving, he's walking in. And somebody said, "What happened? Where were you?" And he said, "Well, I saw Mrs. Jones on my way over and I asked her how she was, and she told me."
So sometimes those distractions are good things. He stopped and listened.
So one of the reasons we don't listen is that we're preoccupied. We're just too busy with ourselves, maybe is the best way to say that.
Yeah, and your example, Tim, that the question of how are you in so many places has been watered down to hello, not truly asking the question for really, how are you? I'm asking you, and then waiting to listen and hear what their answer is. I think it points to what you were talking about in terms of being too busy and preoccupied with ourselves.
So that's one way we can practice, is that if we're going to ask the question, stop and listen.
So again, how are you doing with that one?
Right.
Okay, another reason?
It may be the biggest of all, and that is we don't know how to listen. My understanding of listening is the ability to relate to people with a genuine interest in them and a compassion for them. And I don't think that comes naturally. And I don't think it's easy. I think it takes practice.
And it's different than hearing.
Yes.
We can hear things all around us. You know, as we're recording this, I'm hearing things from outside. I'm hoping you're not hearing them. But am I listening? Am I listening to what Tim just offered in terms of, we don't know how to do this. So if we don't know how to do it, it begs the question, how do we learn? We learn by practicing. And we've probably all experienced times where somebody taught us the skills of active listening, of saying back to people, this is what I heard you say, or can I test something with you? Is this what you're really saying? Because again, this is a place that, and I know that we've talked about this, that we make up what we don't know. And this, I'm jumping now, not to why don't we listen, but a failure of listening, that in the midst of having a conversation with someone, we're not practicing listening. And instead, we're writing our own story and we're making up what this person is saying because we aren't truly paying attention to the words, to the affect of what is happening, to the nonverbals all around them of what's going on.
Well, I think one of the things we have to learn about listening is that it does call for relationship, and it may not be the intimacy of a very close friend or the kind of relationships that we cultivate. But if we're really going to listen, we have to become vulnerable and give ourselves to the person who is speaking.
So what you're pointing to is not knowing how to listen is one of the markers of not really knowing how to be in relationship with one another.
I think that's exactly what I'm saying. So if clear is kind, it may be another reason we don't know how to listen is that we're not related to one another.
and I would take that a step further, Tim, and ask the question, do we value the relationships? Do we value the people who are around us? Do we value the communication that is coming our way? Because you're pointing out relationships, but I can listen to podcasts, and sometimes I really listen. And I am focused on what is being shared to the points there are times I have stopped and written things down, taking notes. It's not just noise in the background. Contrast that with, now you're going to learn a little bit more about my podcast listening than you really care to know, to me hitting play on something and I'm going to sleep. I'm not listening to that. I'm not even paying attention. And in a very real way, the value that I've given to the relationship with those two people or groups of people that are offering those podcasts, one, I've said, here I am, I'm listening, help me to understand, help me to learn, help me to know more. And the other, I'm literally saying, put me to sleep. There's no value in that. And it's a silly example, but that's what we do. We go to sleep on people. We're just
that's a good example.
We're just sleeping with our eyes open. And how is that not only being kind, but in the context of our relationships with one another in the life of being a follower of Jesus? How many times did Jesus get stopped? I'm getting ahead of us, so I'll stop before I start preaching. Tell us the third reason why we don't listen.
Well, it may be the way we're created. I mean, we're created to think faster than we are to talk. And I know that there are statistics and things that go with that, but that's not what I want to say. I want to say our brains can receive spoken words, and we still have time to be thinking. And where that comes to mind for me is that anyone sitting through a sermon on a Sunday morning knows that to be true. I mean, you can sit there and listen to a sermon while you're making a grocery list. You can sit there and listen to a sermon and take some mental sidetrack and miss what's really being said while you're formulating what you would say if you had something to say back. That's part of what I think of one of the barriers to listening, or why we don't listen, is that we actually can think faster than we can speak.
I'm thinking of a story that you have told, and I'm going to screw it up, so you'll have to back up and correct me on how this goes, in terms of listening to a story, listening to a sermon, and where do people get off and where do they get back on the bus that you're taking? If you're taking them on a journey, where do people get off and where do they get back on so that they're staying with you? And we could talk about this on a whole nother episode. I think that is part of the power of story, is that when story is how the brain works. It's how our brain thinks. The structures of stories is literally how our brains are designed to think. We get to the oh crap moments before we ever think about, okay, breathe. This is, it's the fight or flight ape mentality that is a part of our brain that, oh, is this something that I need to fight for? Or can I just relax and listen? We have to go through that. No, we don't stop and think about that. But that's what our brain does. And so if there's something that causes us to think, I need to fight here, or I'm going to wrestle with this here, we're going down a different track. It's your point. We're created to think faster than we can talk. And so listening, I think we make it easier for people to listen when we offer a well-constructed story, because it connects with people who are listening in very natural ways. And to really illustrate that, I probably should have told a story, but I don't have one.
Well, you have illustrated it well, though, in the sense that a good story asks you to get on the bus, you take a ride, but when you're wrestling with what's being said, you may get off the bus at a certain place. And a well-constructed sermon allows us to do that. So just to say we're created to think faster than we talk, if you are a preacher and you're preaching, raising your voice does not emphasize the point. Fred Craddock, who was a professor of mine, used to say, if you have a weak point, don't speak louder. It's at those places where people walk away,
right,
and make their laundry list,
right,
their grocery list.
Tell us number 4.
Well, another reason we don't listen is that we're focused upon issues, and if we don't hear what we want to hear, in regard to those issues or our prejudices, we stop listening and we begin to rehearse our objections without listening to what's being said. Or another way of saying that is that if we're in some kind of conversation and it's not going the way, we're not hearing what we want to hear, we're already forming what we want to say without listening to the totality of what the person's saying. That's related to number 3, because we're always formulating what we want to say, and if it's particularly in a discussion, I don't want to say argument, because it doesn't even have to be argument. But if there's some place of contention, we're more often forming what we want to say while someone else is speaking instead of listening to what they're saying. That would be one. And then the last one, which is sad to say, we don't listen when we don't particularly care for the person that's speaking. Which goes back to the relationship again. So if we've already decided that the person who's speaking is someone we don't particularly care for, we formed our opinions and we dismiss people without giving them an opportunity to be heard. And that's happened all through human history, but particularly now in our country, there are people who are speaking that some people listen to, but other people dismiss. And in the church, we're at that place too. If you're not a part of a certain position, I may not be listening to you. And we've even seen it in our own district. If we're going to have an event at a church, people have already made an opinion of a church space that they're not going to go because they do not like someone or don't care for someone who is in that space. That's one of that we're getting now to a core of why we do not listen.
Is it fair to say that offering ourselves in listening to someone is really an act of love?
Yes. That's exactly what we're saying.
Because as I think through each of the examples and reasons that you pointed to, I may not like you, but if I hold love to be a high value. What's the loving thing to do in that situation? It's to listen. It's to be present. You might be surprised. The same thing goes around issues or stances or prejudices. You know, do you speak up? Do you show up? Or do you just tune it out? What's the loving thing to do? Knowing how we are created, how can we become more conscious of the way that our brains are working so that when we are having a conversation with someone, when we are listening to a sermon on Sunday morning, that we stop and say, you're going down a rabbit hole, get back here. Let's get back to what is happening. What's the loving thing to do? Maybe the greatest act of self-love that we can offer to ourselves is to practice it and to learn how to listen and to recognize the places around us that we are too busy and preoccupied with our own thoughts, that we focus on how can my listening be an expression of love? And yes, I just worked backwards through the 5 reasons that you gave.
So one of the things you've just said is in listening, we take people seriously. I mean, I can think of that. I remember, I'm not proud of this, and if you want to edit it out, you can. But I remember a time when Kim and I were decorating around the outside of the house for Christmas, and she had seen a wreath of some kind that had lights on it that lit up, and she said, one of those lighted wreaths would be great right here. And I said, you don't want one of those. We've got all this other stuff. We want to do that. And I remember distinctly my life changed at that moment because she said to me, don't dismiss me so easily. Just because I say it doesn't mean it's not important. Take me seriously. I can take that moment and put it on top of what we do in the church. When we're saying to the community, we're saying to the world, we're saying to people, you don't want that. This is what you really want, and we're not taking people seriously. So part of what I've just heard you say in terms of this being a way we love people, loving people is not only taking them seriously, but it's being present with them. And that's really what listening does too, is help people know that we're present with them as they're speaking. We don't have to agree. There's nothing that says that listening says you agree.
Right.
Yeah, but what it does say is, I respect you enough, I care for you enough, I love you enough that I can be with you in the midst of these moments as we listen to one another.
So any last thoughts to wrap up becoming a leader who listens and why we don't listen?
Well, I think all I'd say as we finish this one is we live in difficult times in our nation and in the church. It's not easy to listen in the midst of such chaos. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what voices are we focused upon, and how are we being present or loving the people that God's given us to listen to?
So as a final reminder, there's a great need for leaders who listen. You can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/077. And we thank you for listening to this episode and joining us each Tuesday or whatever day you listen to LeaderCast. Remember, becoming a leader who listens has been brought to you by the resources of Transforming Mission. One of the ways that we can learn to listen is by developing the skills through Dare to Lead. Soon we'll be offering a training where you can learn the skills that you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture. It's just one way that we're helping you as a leader to transform your relationships with Christ, the congregation, and your local community. Just checking. Are you still listening? Go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.